I'm honored to be here with both of you, and I should disclose at the outset that I'm not just moderating this panel, but that I was Senator Kennedy's speechwriter and press secretary and then media strategist and consultant for 30 years. Jack's written a superb and deeply researched new biography of Ted Kennedy. And Joe spent an enormous amount of time with him. So this should be a very interesting discussion. Jack, you had already written some pretty powerful books about Richard Nixon, Clarence Darrow, Tip O'Neill. Why did you next turn to Ted Kennedy?
Well, in every case, I felt a curiosity to try to figure out who the person was. Clarence Darrow was a hero of mine, and yet he was such a distant figure. Richard Nixon was the opposite of a hero of mine when I was a young man, but I got the sense that there was something missing in the caricature that we had been presented with as we were growing up. And even though I knew Ted Kennedy and covered him for the hometown newspaper, the Boston Globe, through some very contentious times and issues, and we had developed something of a friendly relationship that you do between a reporter and the subject, I really never felt that I knew the individual and the man. Biography is judgment. No matter how much you hand it to somebody like me who has the ghosts of old city editors on my shoulders saying, seek the other side, be fair, at the end, biography is judgment. And today we're going to judge Ted Kennedy to a certain extent, and I wanted to start out, if I could, with a sort of a thought experiment. Forget that we're talking about a Kennedy. Put yourself in the position of this human being. You're flying to a convention. The airplane pilot makes a mistake and crashes in a thunderstorm. He dies. Your close friend and aide is in the next seat next to the pilot, and he dies. You're the next in line, and your back is shattered. You have 3 vertebrae that are the size now of marbles. And for about 12 hours, it's touch and go whether or not you're going to live. And then they have to decide that you are going to live, but how do they keep you from being paralyzed for the rest of your life? Should we operate, or here's this other route, and this other route means that we're going to strap you into this contraption, and you're not going to move. It's like a cot, and you're not going to move for 6 months. And when that 6 months is over, hopefully the bones have knitted together, and you'll have to learn to walk again at the age of 32, right? That would be the defining moment of my life. I suspect that would be the defining moment of any of your lives. And yet for Ted Kennedy, that plane crash happened, and it was almost incidental considering what else went on in his life. He had 3 children. All 3 children came down with a form of cancer before they were 43. 2 of them as young men. 1 lost his leg. 2 only were saved by experimental treatment. Imagine 3 children. You have 3 children, and all 3 of your children contract cancer, and you spend immense amounts of time in chemotherapy wards and worrying and talking to doctors about this. You have a brother who dies in war, and a sister who dies in an airplane crash, and another sister who is victimized by a botched lobotomy. Now, any one of those things might not be a defining feature of your life, but they would have an immense impact in your life, and yet, to Ted Kennedy, they're almost parenthetical. Throughout all of this, your wife suffers from alcoholism, and she is not the steady partner that you will need to get through all this, some of which is your own fault, which drenches you in guilt. And we haven't even come to JFK and RFK, but your brothers are shot down, murdered by crazy assassins in a very public position with all the weight of the world on you. And finally, in your 30s, you're in a car accident, and the passenger, an aide to one of your brothers, is killed. And for the rest of your life, you are wrestling with that guilt. Again, for any one of us, any one of those incidents would have been the thing you talked about, the thing you thought about when you got up in the morning, and the thing you said your prayers about when you went to bed at night. And yet, that long list of stuff is just part of what Ted Kennedy had to deal with. So, all of which is a way of saying, be careful how you judge him. Be appreciative of his ability to persist and to persevere and marvel at the fruit of his hard work in the Senate, his ability to marshal his talents, his family name, the acclaim, and reserve judgment on Ted. And I think that sort of compassionate view on anybody's life, believe it or not, I thought I could bring that to Nixon. I thought I can bring it to Ted Kennedy, and that's trying to feel that compassion for your subject is very important, and I think highly important in Ted Kennedy's life.
So I'm gonna pick up on something you just said. He was elected to the Senate when he was the minimum age. He was just 30. And there were a lot of skeptics. His primary opponent said, if your name were Edward Moore instead of Edward Moore Kennedy, your candidacy would be a joke, which, by the way, killed the primary opponent. People all over the state got so angry that he said that to the brother of the President of the United States that killed him. Then he became the lion of the Senate. What happened?
He grew. It's a cliche. He had great genes, great political genes, going back to his grandparents. He was a marvelous human being. Within the family, he was shortchanged because he was the ninth kid. He was the baby brother. There was never an expectation that Teddy was going to be the leader of the family politically or just within the family unit. That was always going to be somebody else. It was going to be Brother Joe. If it wasn't going to be Brother Joe, then Jack would step up. And they actually talked about this. If JFK said, if I fall, Bobby will pick up the standard, and if Bobby falls, Teddy will be there. So it was like a known thing, but nobody ever expected that silly, fat little Teddy would be the one to have to do this. And I don't believe in redemption, especially in Ted Kennedy's case, but I do believe in atonement. And I really believe that he worked very hard to atone. And I think that the other thing that, Bob, is that he said this himself at the end of his life, I filled every moment. I ran fast to stay ahead of the dark. And a lot of that energy that we saw on the Senate floor or jet setting around the world was to stay ahead of the dark because the weight of all that tragedy would have pulled him down. I once wrote a piece about him in the '94 election, and I said he was like a great white shark who had to keep swimming because if sharks don't keep swimming, they drown. That's the way that they breathe. And he wrote me back a little note, and he signed the note, as he was wont to do, with a little sketch of a shark, and signed it Ted the Shark. So I think he most definitely agreed with that theory.
Joe, how did he influence your own public service? What lessons did he impart? How did he do it?
Thanks for coming, everybody, and thanks for including me in this. And Bob, true to form, your introduction dramatically shortchanged the influence that you had on him and every other member of my family that's been involved in public service. So,
and may I also say that Bob and Tom, who were here, were my ace readers, and I also must nod to my ace researcher out there, who was my wife of 40 years. So, it has always been interesting for me to hear a bit of the narrative that John just articulated about my uncle, because certainly by the time I came of age, he wasn't the ninth child, the little brother, the one that didn't have any expectations. He was Senator Kennedy, and he was, at that point in my life, he was our larger family patriarch. He was the person that commanded extraordinary amounts of respect, and the person that kind of, had his hand in everything, right? He was
he was a giant of an individual, but the question that I get asked an awful lot, Bob, is kind of what was it like to grow up a member of my family, and there's a bit of complexity in that answer, but the part that most people focus on when they say what's it like to grow up part of the Kennedy family is the Kennedy part. It's not the family part, right? It shortchanges the part that even through high school he was at our football games. And there were like 3 fans at our football games, right? We were terrible. But he still was, he was there for a lot of it. He took an awful lot of joy, and I think given the turbulence that he experienced throughout his life, there were some grounding forces in it, right? His faith was certainly one of those. He has said, Bob, as you well know, that the Beatitudes were part of the foundational aspect of his life and his service and his dedication to kind of Democratic Party principles. But family was another one, right? And the part that, for very understandable reasons, so much of the analysis about my uncle is about these historic moments that Jack references and touches on, and so many others have as well. What I always focus on in that is it's the family side of it, right? It's the fact that after every Thanksgiving or every Thanksgiving weekend, he would have a sing-along, which, with all due respect to my uncle, what he lacked in musical talent, he made up for in volume and confidence, right? So, like, it was not, you weren't going to hear anybody in Carnegie Hall, but that's not what it was about, right? It was about being able to fill a room with family and friends and belt out Irish ballads. And he loved it, right? But he just loved being around people that no matter what, and one of the central tenets of my family and why my family has relied on other family members through so much of those challenges and campaigns and whatever else, is no matter what happens, they ain't going anywhere, right? They are still there. And politics is a tough business, and a lot of ups and downs and a lot of brutality that comes with it. And you don't often find people like a Bob Shrum that no matter what happens, will always be there. Family will be there.
So I want to pick up on something you just said, the sing-alongs, the camaraderie, because I think he brought that to the Senate too. And I mean, the flip side of Ted Kennedy as the liberal lion was his capacity to recruit unlikely allies across the aisle. I think of AIDS funding and children's health insurance with Utah Republican Orrin Hatch, immigration reform with Alan Simpson, a Republican from Wyoming. Jack, can you square that circle for us?
The personality was so large. There's a wonderful story, and it's unfortunately going to include profanity, but that's life. Down in the well of the Senate is right below where the reporters sit. And if you lean over as a reporter, you can hear, basically you're just hearing clerks and stuff like that. But there was one time where Ted and John McCain got in an argument, and speaking from their desks, and it began to get a little bit more personal, and finally McCain dropped his microphone and walked down into the well, and to the great delight of all the reporters in the Senate press gallery, Ted Kennedy dropped his microphone and walked down into the well. And John McCain said, "Fuck you, Ted." And Ted Kennedy said, "Fuck you, John." And they had it out right there as every reporter was sitting there writing this down. But then they walked out of the chamber, and Ted threw his arm around McCain and said, "John, I think we went a little too far there, didn't we?" And McCain, whose motto was never let a good fight not fought is a spoiled day, appreciated that. And over time, over the years, they became good friends. And John McCain won the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award, and was in tears, as much of the Senate was, when Ted Kennedy passed away. And I'm telling you now, this is my personal feeling that I've never been able to validate from anything, but when John McCain walked on the Senate floor and did that thumbs up to save the Affordable Care Act, part of the reason he was doing that was that Ted Kennedy was holding his arm up.
Joe, I don't think, he could have lived a life of ease or withdrawn to one at any point along the difficult road that Jack outlined. I don't think, as I knew him, that he ever even thought about leaving the political battlefield. What kept him at the forefront of the fight for so long, all the way to the end of his life?
I think a couple things, Bob, and obviously speculation here. One, I think he felt he was good at it, and I think he was good at it. But he also had the extraordinary experience over his life to know that it mattered, right? I mean, if you think about where the country was when he was a young man and is newly elected to the Senate at 30, and with a brother as president and the other as attorney general, and to see what they went through and what the country went through in those in the 1960s, and to see what the United States also meant, right? What it meant to going through those political battles here, what it meant for a young president to go to Germany and give that speech at Brandenburg Gate in front of those hundreds of thousands of people, what it meant for him to go to Ireland a couple weeks later, and then, not even a year later, be gone. What it meant to see, again, that young president in that same kind of 2-week span address civil rights as a moral question, as old as the scriptures and clear as the Constitution. What it meant to take on challenges of apartheid around the world, to take on for Teddy issues of civil rights in Bangladesh. What it meant to do all of this and to lean in and to know that you could uniquely for him make a difference about it, that your presence in these places mattered, that you contributed to that debate, that you could, by nature of the station that he occupied, use that to shine a light on promise and injustice. And that if you have that privilege, to not leverage it to your fullest, leaves something on the table and not just an opportunity squandered, but that there's real human cost to not doing it. And that's the part that I think people know, but I think what he understood and what touched him about it was the belief that, for better and worse, that government matters and the quality of government matters and your dedication to it matters, and that it is really hard work. But that you can get better with it over time if you engage people and you don't judge people and you are dedicated to knowing that that outcome ultimately will affect the lives of millions and millions of people. And he was uniquely situated to be able to do that, both domestically and abroad. But he did. I mean, look, I walked down the street and one, it was awkward. I'd been in office for 10 years and I would still get my colleagues that called me either Teddy, Bob, or Jack. And I was like, 0 for 3, but I appreciate you trying, right? Like, at least go with Kennedy, right? Like, that's easier. I mean, good Lord. But that people will still say, some of you, I met your uncle. I shook your uncle's hand. People that talk about, I saw somebody a little while ago who he helped escape Russia, right? And had loved ones. I mean, he just, the reach that he had and the validation that he had from people sharing those stories back with him to know that he made a difference. I mean, that is in of itself an extraordinary reward.
Yeah.
Hey,
Go ahead.
I managed to get a few pages from his diary in the different files that I went through. And one of the most fascinating ones was when he was interviewing then candidate Chief Justice John Roberts. And Roberts came in and Ted sat down and in one paragraph sort of summed up his philosophy of government. And he said to Roberts, he said, and this sort of fits into the theme of what we've been hearing the last couple of days. And he said to Roberts, he said, American history is a continuum. This is Ted talking. This is the way I see it. You started off with just the founding fathers, just property owners and males, and then it was working men got the vote, and then women got the vote, and then you had civil rights, and you had women rights, and you had gay rights, and and he says to Roberts, he says, this is a continuum, and there's nothing inevitable about it. We go back we slide back from time to time, but every one of us has to make the choice. Are you going to be part of the continuum, or are you going to be a retrogressive? Are you going to be somebody who blocks it, who is an obstacle? And, I like to think that that question posed to Roberts perhaps made him think a little and made him a little bit less extreme than the other members of the Supreme Court today. That's probably just a fantasy, but I think that's a great philosophy. It's a great telling of the American tale. And it really, I believe, is what he believed. He was shocked when things like the Voting Rights Act, which he had worked with Bob Dole, Jesse Jackson, and Ronald Reagan to get a 25-year extension of the Voting Rights Act. And when it was done and it came under attack again, he said, I felt like I was hit between the eyes with a 2x4 because I thought that was a settled battle. But it's never a settled battle. It's always something that we have to continue to fight over and over again. James Carville was just talking about campaign finance and how our system has gotten into this abysmal state today. Well, right after Watergate, Ted Kennedy, working with the Republican leader of the Senate, passed a bill that was written on the front page of the New York Times. It was described as legislation that will end the influence of big money in politics forever. Well, we saw how that worked out. But that's an example of how, the perseverance, the coming to work every day, and the diligence is as important as the magnetism of the great speeches.
Yeah, he and Hugh Scott, who was the Republican leader, actually passed a bill that never became law because it didn't get through the House, that would have provided for public funding of all federal elections, which would have drastically changed the way we govern. I want to stay on this civil rights, standing up for people for a minute, because we talked about his capacity to reach across the aisle and do things, and it doesn't count for nothing that 8 million poor kids in America suddenly had health care because he and Orrin Hatch got together. But there were other places, and you alluded to this, where he stood his ground and he pushed the stone up the hill and up the hill and up the hill, and sometimes got it to the top of the hill. I was with him in South Africa in 1985, where the apartheid regime attacked him, alleging that he was just there to court African-American voters for a 1988 presidential run. So we came back to America before the year was out. He renounced any presidential ambitions ever, saying, the presidency is not my life, public service is. And he then led in the campaign to enact sanctions on South Africa, which ultimately passed over Ronald Reagan's veto, one of the few times a Reagan veto was overridden.
And while he was doing that, he and Orrin Hatch were leading the federal response to the AIDS epidemic that had been completely ignored, not completely ignored, but very much ignored by the Reagan administration for the first 3 or 4 years. And then all of a sudden, Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy make this binding agreement that they're going to resist Jesse Helms and the far right, which wants to turn this into a divisive issue. And the major AIDS legislation on the book today, which then leads to the Americans for Disability Act. And he's doing all these things at the same time because he's had this marvelous staff, not to paint you guys as too heroically, but he had the ability to get the best and the brightest from all over the country. And they were a huge staff because he had been there long enough that he had all these subcommittees everywhere, so that they were almost like a force to themselves. And everybody else, like Joe Biden, knew that if the Kennedy machine came out, not machine, but if the Kennedy operation came out on behalf of this issue or this bill, that you had a choice. You could go along and be part of the laurels and have your name on the bill, the Kassebaum-Kennedy bill, or you could try to resist and be cast in history as the Jesse Helms of the era.
Which I think, touching on that for a second, I remember when I first got elected, somebody said to me, how are you going to set up your office? And I was trying to figure that out because no one tells you how to set up an office. And I started to articulate, chief of staff, legislative director, kind of these cookie cutter approach to it. And understanding there was a big difference between where I was starting and where my uncle finished, said, you're going about that backwards. One of the things that made Teddy so good was he flips the working chart, the org tree upside down, right? It wasn't, you have all of these staff members supporting Ted Kennedy. It was, find the best talent that you can possibly get. Understand you will not have them forever, but for as long as you have them, if you have a staff of 100 and you empower them to go solve a problem, when they run into a problem, they can then call you in, and all of a sudden it's Ted Kennedy on the phone wondering why something isn't working, right? And that way he was able to multiply his impact, because if you have that level of talent that is empowered to go out there and solve challenges facing the American public, you now have one person supporting 100, not 100 supporting one, and you are 100 times more effective. And if you do that over time, you have a staff that then is populating not just federal government agencies, but foundations and businesses and nonprofits and other government positions. And as
You have a guy who worked for you on the Judiciary Committee who's suddenly on the Supreme Court of the United States.
which doesn't hurt either, right? And the extraordinary ability and camaraderie that he was able to foster, which meant 2 generations later, when some 31-year-old Yahoo decides to run for Congress, they can call somebody and say, help me with a speech, right? And that still worked.
So we've been talking about both the fights and the achievements. It's been written that he achieved more change than many presidents have. I think that's probably true. Remarkable legislative accomplishments in the 70s, the late 80s, the 90s, and then he stood alone against the Iraq War, or almost alone against the Iraq War, and for marriage equality in the early 2000s, well before almost anybody else, all along fighting a 40-year battle to pass national health reform, where he finally secured a commitment to get it done from Barack Obama when he endorsed him in 2008. Jack, how do you assess his record when you step back and you read that book and you look at his whole life and where he ranks among the great senators of American history?
Well, there is one room which has the busts of the paintings of the 5 great senators, and John F. Kennedy was the chairman of that committee back in the 50s, I guess it was, who decided who they were. If there was another building on Capitol Hill for a Senate office building, a Kennedy office building would be quite appropriate. He influenced all of your lives. I mean, whether it was not just preserving Medicare, casting his vote and getting a pen from Lyndon Johnson for being there at the time, down to the Affordable Care Act, where part of the reason that he endorsed Barack Obama was that he got a commitment from Obama that no matter how bad things were after the 2008 crash, the Democratic president was going to push with that bulldog of a speaker, Nancy Pelosi, to get that bill through Congress, and they did. And one of my favorite Teddy stories is that he knew he was dying. He was very close to death. He knew the Affordable Care Act was moving through his committee. I'm going to get teary probably here. And he wrote a posthumous letter to be opened after his death to Barack Obama, and it said, basically, I'm not going to be there with you when we cross the when we cross the Jordan to the Promised Land, but I know you're going to lead us to there, and this the cause of my life, is going to be in fruition. And Obama read that letter and was profoundly moved and used it when he made the speech to revive the push for the Affordable Care Act that basically ended in its passage. And in his memoir, Obama says that the night that it was signed, they had a party, they clinked glasses at the White House, everybody went home, and Obama says, I went upstairs and I thought about my mom and the trouble she had dealing with breast cancer, and I thought about Ted Kennedy. So I'm going to go sit in a room until I can collect myself, but he was a remarkable human being. God knows he had his flaws, but I think, again, back to that question about compassionate biography and how you judge, I think he was a giant bum.
Joe, before I turn to a question about his campaigning, I wanted to ask you to imagine what Ted Kennedy would think of our politics today, how he'd navigate it.
Look, I think I don't like speaking for family members, Bob, as you know, that particularly aren't here to correct me. So with a grain of salt, right? Look, I think not going to surprise anybody here, right? He stood for a different type of politics, right? What he believed in was a different type of politics. And that's not where you shied away from debate. He was famous for engaging in that rough and tumble and wanted to live in a country where you did, right? Like, that's the point. You're not supposed to get along on everything in a democracy. You're supposed to be willing to engage and roll up your sleeves and have these battles, and you can have passionate ones, and you're supposed to, but you're also not supposed to dehumanize your fellow representatives and certainly your fellow Americans. And so how you are able to continue to advance and be relentless in that pursuit. I think I remember when I was first got elected, going around and meeting a bunch of my senior colleagues in the House, Democrats and Republicans, and hope he doesn't mind me sharing this, but seeing Speaker Boehner, seeing then Paul Ryan, and going to see, then he was chair of the Budget Committee, and seeing, sat down at a table in his office, and he said, you know, I bet you're hearing from a bunch of your fellow Democrats how much you miss Ted Kennedy, that the reality is we miss him more. I said, well, why is that? And he said, because his word was good. And I didn't agree with him on much, but he was relentless at trying to get to yes, and if he gave you his word, he would fight for it, but he could bring the left along, right? He had such credibility with coalitions and with organizations on the left that if he said he was going to do something, he could bring them with him. And Chairman Ryan at that point said, there's very few others at this point that have the credibility to bring others with them. And I think the combination of the dehumanization that we are experiencing in our politics and the change a bit, as John alluded to earlier, of the view of our country as a continuum, right? President Obama wrote about that eloquently as well. My uncle did, as you referred to, of saying, you know, our time here is limited. Your job is to, as kind of I always thought of it, when we said we the people, that we initially meant rich, white, Protestant men, and every generation is to expand the definition of we, right? Make that bigger, more inclusive, bolder, stronger. But you got a limited time to do it. But you want to, our goal is to make that a bigger, stronger place. And in order to do that, you have to settle for pieces. You have to move forward when you can. And if you leave something on the table, it means that, particularly for issues about healthcare, if you are able to get a bite, even if it's not the full apple, but a bite, if you don't take that bite, there will be people that suffer because you didn't take the bite. Right? There will be real pain that is there because you held out for the perfect rather than settling for the good. And knowing that if you take that step now, it doesn't mean it's over. It means the moment that bill is signed, you start again on the rest of it. And you have a relentlessness with which you fight for that continued American story and that continued expansion of we.
I want to talk about politics for a minute, campaigning, because I found him to be one of the most talented natural politicians I've ever seen in my life, if not the most. But I was there when he ran for president against an incumbent of his own party as a speechwriter. In 1980, we lost. And then he had a very tough re-election in 1994 against a young man named Mitt Romney. And I was there as the campaign strategist when we won an unexpectedly wide victory. But in both campaigns, he was a happy warrior. He was a steady and determined presence. He never blamed anyone when things went wrong. Jack, your narrative about those campaigns is gripping. What did they reveal about him to you?
I think 1980 was actually the flawed side. I think you guys helped give us Ronald Reagan. I know we've had this discussion, and you think that Jimmy Carter would have lost that year no matter what. But when I interviewed Carter, he said 3 things cost me the presidency. One was the oil and gasoline crisis. The other was the Iranian hostage. And the third was I had a primary opponent who, after I beat, would not go away. And that went right to the convention in New York and continued. Now, I'm not going to go into more profanity, but the Carter people were real SOBs. So there was no love on either side for each other, and it unfortunately degenerated into such a fight of Boston versus Atlanta, and Harold Ickes versus Jody Powell, and it was that I think was a sad moment for the party. But in that race, he bungled his entry into the race and got hit right away with the Iranian hostage crisis. And basically, I think, in retrospect, the campaign was over at that point because Carter used it so effectively. If you remember, we were flags and the Olympic hockey team and songs about yellow ribbons, and Carter just attached himself to that. And it took the country a while to wake up to that. But in the middle of all that, Mr. Shrum et al. Write this speech for Teddy, and he gives it at Georgetown University. And he basically says, this is what I believe in. This is what the left of the party stands for. The Carter people are not representing these values. And that basically became his guiding philosophy, I think, that statement of liberal intent for the rest of his life. Am I wrong in that? I mean,
No, look, I've told you when you were writing the book, and I've said it in my own book, Ted Kennedy was the worst politician at saying nothing that I've ever met. I mean, lots of politicians are just great at saying nothing.
Yeah.
And when we started out in that campaign, and I, went to work for him not long before he announced, but when we started out in that campaign, he was so far ahead of Carter that the strategy was fundamentally to say nothing, and he hated it.
Yeah.
He was uncomfortable. And when he lost the Iowa caucus, we had led the Iowa caucuses 2-1 after the Iranian hostage crisis, and the president locked himself in the White House or the Rose Garden. We suddenly lost Iowa 2-1. He, I think, felt liberated to go out and be himself and say what he was going to say.
Okay, now here's a very important, let me interrupt you right there. Time and time again, as Ted Kennedy gets closer to the presidency, he self-sabotages himself. I, as a biographer, formed the theory based on a lot of his contemporaries that he never thought himself worthy of Jack and Bob, of being the president, and so that this self-sabotage was a psychological hindrance.
You and I would disagree.
Oh, yeah, right. But he was always,
let me
the
tell you.
closer he got, the worse he performed.
Okay, let me tell you something.
Yeah.
At the convention in 1980, and he rehearsed that speech over and over and over again. And if you go back and read it, it could have been given as an acceptance speech. And there was a paragraph in there which said, I congratulate President Carter on his victory here, and we'll reunite as Democrats and move on to a Democratic victory in November. When we were practicing it, before the rules vote, which sealed the nomination for Carter, we would get to that part on the teleprompter, and he'd go like this. I have no doubt that he wanted to be president, and I think what happened in '80 is a lot of his colleagues came to him and said, we're going to lose if Carter's the nominee. You got to run. As I said, he was so far ahead, he didn't feel compelled the campaign felt compelled to say to him again and again, don't go out there and say anything that's going to kick over the traces.
Yeah.
And I mean, they got mad at me because I was on the plane, and one day he just decided to talk about tough antitrust enforcement, and the consumers were being exploited all across the country. And they called up and they were really mad, and somebody said, you have to send Shrum back home. He said, I made the decision. I decided I wanted to talk about this. So, yeah, I think he wanted to be president. The South Africa example, he was not going to sacrifice his convictions and things he thought were important if that was the price of running for president. I mean, I told him in '88 when I got up to Hyannis, it was December, it was cold. I walked in, he said, I'm not going to, I've decided I'm not going to run in 1988. I said, you get to run against George Bush. He said, I've decided I'm not going to run in 1988. And that's where the line came from, the presidency is not my life, public service is.
Yep. And then he went on to become the Lion of the Senate.
Yeah.
Freed from that burden, he was spectacular.
Yeah. Well, and I think in many ways, people underestimate some of what he did long before he ran in 80, whether it was the work on refugees in the 1960s, airline and trucking deregulation in the 1970s, some of the stuff that he was doing when Tom was working for him.
He was almost single-handedly responsible in the Senate with Robert's help in passing the third great Civil Rights Act, which was the Immigration Reform Act of 1965. It was down on everybody's priority because the other two acts had all the attention, but it changed the complexion in America in a revolutionary way, and it's something else we need to talk about, which is that family legacy issues were hugely important, and immigration was one that Honey Fitz, the mayor of Boston, had fought for, and John F. Kennedy had made a name as a senator for, and so when it came Ted's time, he embraced this immigration law, and he was the immigration senator until right to the end of his career, where he almost cut a deal with, believe it or not, Lindsey Graham, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush to pass immigration reform. They missed out by this much. But
Yeah, well, I think about the legacy because JFK had written a book called The Nation of Immigrants, where he had amended the poem on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, as long as they're from Northern Europe, as long as they're white, as long as they never stole a loaf of bread in their lives. And that's in A Nation of Immigrants. And the president proposed it in '63, but he was gone shortly thereafter. Joe, how important was, do you think, the legacy aspect of this, the sense that he was carrying on the work of his brothers?
Bob, I don't think you can get away from it, right? I mean, I alluded to it in passing before, the fact that even after a decade, my colleagues called me Teddy, Jack, or Bobby, right? I mean, so there's no, you can't get by it. And I have no doubt that was always there. I also know from a bit of my own experience in this, you can't, and he couldn't, and he earned his way through this. He earned a legacy of his own, right? So he wasn't just carrying on that of his brothers or sisters and their contributions as well, which sometimes don't get celebrated the way they should. But he was able to. There's a reason why he was a happy warrior, right? And he was a happier warrior when he was out with people. I remember in one of his campaigns, or I think it was for President Obama, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. My Spanish still works, so somebody had the idea that he was going to do I think a robocall or something in Spanish, and they sent me to try to get him through it. By the end of it, I just did it. But I remember going down to the Rio Grande Valley with him. Bob, the Obama campaign sent a plane. We picked us up in Hyannis. We went down with Michael Myers and a bunch of other folks and did a swing through the RGV and ended up, I think, that night in Brownsville. And we walk into this big hall at the end, and it's been a very long day campaigning. And it's a big room, and there's nobody there. Nobody. And I walk in, I'm like, yikes. And there were 5 people, and he couldn't have cared less. He got up behind a microphone and started belting out the Mexican ballad Guadalajara at the top of his lungs in Spanish that was unintelligible, right? But hands over the head, clapping, singing, dancing, and the 5 people that were there, were at first stunned and then, loved it. And it didn't matter. It was just, to him, politics was about people and it was about an opportunity to, celebrate the fact that after this long day and whatever else, they were there and they were all that mattered. And he was going to let them know that he was grateful for them there in the way that he could. And He loved it.
He liked to tell stories about himself, and one of my favorites was in '62 he was running against Ed McCormick, who was the nephew of Speaker of the House John McCormick, and it was Eddie versus Teddy, and it was all over Life magazine and a huge political. And in the middle of the debate that they had at South Boston High School, Ed McCormick said, "Kennedy, you haven't worked a day in your life, and there's no way that you should have this seat." So the next, everybody believed that he had lost. And the next day, they sent him out to shake hands, and he went to this bakery, and the guy behind the counter said to him, "Hey, Kennedy, I understand that you never worked a day in your life." And Teddy said, "I braced because I knew what was coming." And the guy said, "You haven't missed a thing."
This is a marvelous book. And if you've enjoyed this session, you will love this book. He was everything that both of you described and more. He was my friend and my inspiration. So, Jack, congratulations. Everybody go out and buy this book.